Silent mistakes in the forest and deadly oversights at sea reveal how bear attacks unfold in the narrow space where confidence slips into catastrophe. These predators, grizzlies, Kodiaks, and polar bears, strike fast and with terrifying precision, often triggered by a single misstep. Whether it's a disabled deterrent, a forgotten ramp, or a camera lens turned the wrong way, small errors have unleashed nature's most fearsome hunters on unsuspecting humans. From a tactical unit torn apart in Russia to a polar bear boarding a ship in the Arctic, we explore 6 horrifying bear encounters in this video. The remote forests of Ussuri Krai in Russia's Far East had always been a lawless frontier, where poachers operated with impunity among the towering birch and pine trees. On July 1, 2025, 9 officers from Russia's Specialized Wildlife Enforcement Unit prepared to infiltrate this wilderness. Their mission was to monitor a suspected poaching ring that had been decimating the region's endangered Asiatic black bear population for months. Dmitry Volkonsky, a veteran with 15 years of experience tracking illegal hunters across Siberia's most dangerous territories, led the unit. The Ussuri Krai region, bordering China and North Korea, had become notorious for its cross-border wildlife trafficking operations. Local authorities reported that poachers had been using sophisticated equipment and military-grade weapons, making standard enforcement operations nearly impossible. The team arrived at their insertion point fully equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance technology. Each officer carried night vision goggles, thermal imaging cameras, and drones capable of silent reconnaissance. However, their most important equipment was an ultrasonic bear deterrent system designed by Moscow's Institute of Biological Problems. The device emitted high-frequency sounds that kept predators, particularly the massive Russian grizzlies that roamed these forests, at a safe distance from human camps. During their briefing, Yegor Mishkin, the unit's communications specialist, had expressed concerns about the deterrent system. Mishkin argued that the ultrasonic frequencies might interfere with their sensitive audio surveillance equipment, potentially compromising their ability to monitor poacher communications. His technical background made him the most qualified to make such assessments, and his fellow officers respected his expertise. The team established their base camp in a clearing approximately 12 kilometers from the suspected poaching site. Volkonsky positioned sentries and established communication protocols, while the others set up their monitoring equipment. The forest around them seemed unusually quiet, with only the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. As darkness fell, Mishkin made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Worried that the ultrasonic deterrent would interfere with their audio equipment during the critical overnight surveillance, he quietly turned off the device. The switch was small and inconspicuous, located on the back of the unit. Mishkin told himself he would reactivate it before dawn, but he failed to inform any of his teammates about his decision. The officers settled into their tents, confident in their security perimeter and professional preparation. Volkonsky had chosen experienced men for this mission, who had survived dangerous encounters with criminals and wildlife during their careers. They had no reason to suspect that their most important line of defense against the forest's apex predator had been silently eliminated. At approximately 2:30 a.m., a massive Russian grizzly weighing nearly 400 kilograms approached their camp. The bear had been disturbed by increased human activity in its territory due to ongoing poacher operations. Stressed and territorial, it had been tracking human scents for several days. Under normal circumstances, the ultrasonic deterrent would have caused the animal to retreat long before reaching the camp perimeter. Instead, the bear encountered no resistance as it moved silently through the trees surrounding the clearing. The animal's massive paws made virtually no sound on the forest floor as it circled the camp, investigating the unfamiliar scents and sounds. Pavel Gromov was returning from retrieving a surveillance drone when he spotted the enormous silhouette moving between the tents. From his position on a nearby ridge, approximately 50 meters away, he watched in horror as the situation unfolded. Gromov later reported that the bear moved with terrifying efficiency, as if it had been hunting humans for years. The attack began when the grizzly tore through the first tent where Mishkin was sleeping. The communications specialist barely had time to scream before the bear's massive claws ripped through the fabric and into his chest. Torn canvas and braking equipment echoed through the forest as other officers scrambled from their sleeping bags. Radio communications immediately jammed due to damaged equipment or the bear's interference with their systems. The officers' sidearms proved useless in the chaos as the massive animal rapidly moved from tent to tent. The grizzly's strength was overwhelming, easily crushing equipment and human bodies with equal ease. Volkonsky managed to fire 3 shots from his service pistol, but the bullets seemed not to affect the enraged animal. The bear caught him as he attempted to reach the emergency flare gun, lifting the senior lieutenant off the ground and shaking him like a toy before moving to the next tent. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes. 8 officers were killed, their bodies scattered across the destroyed campsite. Gromov remained frozen on the ridge, unable to help his colleagues and terrified that any movement would draw the bear's attention to his position. The bear eventually disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a scene of complete devastation. Gromov waited until dawn before approaching the camp, where he discovered Mishkin's body near the disabled deterrent device. The tiny switch that could have saved 8 lives remained in the off position. The incident was a stark reminder that sometimes nature punishes without mercy. The pristine waters of the Skeena River in British Columbia had carved their way through the Canadian wilderness for thousands of years, creating one of the most spectacular kayaking destinations in North America. In September 2019, the river system was experiencing its annual salmon run, drawing wildlife and outdoor enthusiasts to its banks. 29-year-old Clara had chosen this remote section of the river for a solo kayaking expedition, seeking solitude away from the crowded tourist routes further downstream. The Skeena River region had been home to indigenous peoples for millennia before European exploration in the 1800s. The area's dense cedar, hemlock, and spruce forests provided perfect habitat for British Columbia's thriving black bear population. During salmon season, these bears congregated along riverbanks to take advantage of the abundant fish, making encounters with human visitors increasingly common. Clara had been paddling for 3 days when she first noticed the black bear on September 15th. The animal appeared on the river's eastern bank, approximately 30 meters away, moving parallel to her kayak with what seemed like casual interest. British Columbia's black bears were known to follow rivers during salmon season, so Clara initially dismissed the sighting as coincidental wildlife behavior. However, as she continued downstream for the next hour, the bear maintained its position along the riverbank. Clara began to feel uneasy as the animal consistently matched her pace, never falling behind or moving ahead. She had encountered bears during previous wilderness trips, but none had shown such persistent interest in human activity. The bear moved through the riverside vegetation with fluid grace, occasionally disappearing behind trees, only to reappear moments later. Clara decided to test the bear's intentions by implementing standard bear deterrent techniques. She began shouting across the water, her voice echoing off the surrounding forest. The bear's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but continued its steady progress along the bank. She then banged her aluminum paddle against the side of her kayak, creating sharp metallic sounds that carried across the river. Still, the bear showed no signs of losing interest or changing direction. The situation became increasingly disturbing as Clara realized she had unconsciously increased her paddling speed, yet the bear effortlessly kept pace. Clara estimated that the bear had been following her for over a mile, an unusually long distance for what should have been casual wildlife behavior. The animal's persistent attention suggested something more concerning than curiosity about human presence. Growing concerned about her safety, Clara used the river's current to distance herself from the persistent predator. She launched her kayak into a section where the water moved more rapidly, hoping the bear would lose interest once she gained significant distance. The strategy seemed logical, as most bears would be unlikely to pursue prey across moving water, especially when easier food sources were available along the banks. To her absolute horror, Clara watched as the black bear entered the river without hesitation. The animal's swimming ability exceeded her expectations, moving through the water with powerful strokes, quickly closing the distance between them. Clara realized with growing panic that she was being actively hunted by a predator equally comfortable on land and in water. The bear's head remained above the surface as it swam, its dark eyes never leaving her kayak. Clara paddled frantically toward a gravel bar in the middle of the river channel, hoping the shallow water would provide some advantage or refuge. Her arms burned with exertion as she drove her kayak toward what appeared to be her only option for escape. Behind her, she could hear the steady splash of the bears swimming, a sound that seemed to grow closer with each stroke, despite her desperate efforts. Upon reaching the gravel bar, Clara quickly dragged her kayak onto the rocky surface and turned to assess her pursuer's position. The bear was less than 20 meters away, swimming directly toward her location with determination. Its massive form moved through the water with surprising speed and efficiency, demonstrating the swimming prowess that made black bears such versatile predators. Clara screamed as loudly as possible, hoping to intimidate the animal or attract potential help from other river users. Her voice echoed across the water, but the remote location made rescue unlikely. The bear reached the gravel bar and immediately charged from the water, its massive form emerging like something from a nightmare. Water streamed from its thick black fur as it bounded toward her with terrifying speed. Clara watched in terror as the animal's jaws snapped shut just feet from her backpack, which she had instinctively thrown between herself and the charging predator. The bear's breath was hot and rank, its eyes focused entirely on her with predatory intensity. She could see the powerful muscles beneath its wet fur and the sharp claws that could easily tear through human flesh. In desperation, Clara reached for her emergency flare gun, a safety equipment she had never hoped to use. She fired the flare directly into the air above the bear's head, creating a brilliant explosion of red light and a sharp bang that echoed across the water. The sudden noise and light seemed to break the bear's focus, causing it to pause and look around uncertainly. The bear hesitated for several seconds before turning and moving downstream along the gravel bar, eventually disappearing into the forest on the opposite bank. Clara crouched in the shallow water for nearly an hour, her legs cut from the sharp river stones, and her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip her paddle. The psychological impact of the encounter would affect her approach to wilderness activities for years to come, serving as a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability in the natural world. The Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana represented one of America's last truly wild frontiers, encompassing over 1 million acres of pristine forest, alpine meadows, and rugged mountain terrain. In August 2017, veteran wildlife photographer Thaddeus Blackwood and his assistant Ezra Thornfield adventured deep into this wilderness to document grizzly bear behavior for a prestigious nature magazine. The Bob Marshall had gained a reputation among wildlife photographers for its healthy grizzly population and stunning natural backdrops that provided perfect settings for capturing predator behavior. The Bob Marshall Wilderness, established in 1964, was named after a conservationist who advocated for preserving America's wild spaces. The area's remote location and strict wilderness designation prohibited motorized vehicles, requiring photographers to pack equipment on horseback or carry it for miles on foot. This isolation created ideal conditions for observing wildlife behavior without human interference, but it also meant that help was days away in case of emergencies. Thaddeus had spent 23 years documenting dangerous wildlife across 6 continents, building a reputation for capturing intimate moments between predators and their environment. His assistant, Ezra, though less experienced, had worked with Thaddeus for 3 years and understood the protocols necessary for safe wildlife photography. Their current assignment focused on documenting maternal behavior among grizzly bears, particularly the relationship between sows and their cubs during the late summer feeding season. The photography team had been tracking a particular grizzly sow and her 2 cubs for 5 days, maintaining what they believed was a safe distance of 100 yards while using telephoto lenses to capture detailed images. The bears had become accustomed to their presence, showing no signs of stress or aggressive behavior. Thaddeus's experience suggested that this level of habituation was ideal for obtaining natural behavioral footage without disturbing the animal's normal activities. On August 18th, the photographers positioned themselves on a rocky ridge overlooking a meadow where the grizzly family frequently foraged. Thaddeus used a 600mm lens mounted on a sturdy tripod, while Ezra operated video equipment from a secondary position. The wind direction favored their concealment, carrying their scent away from the bears below and allowing them to observe without detection. The sow and her cubs were engaged in typical foraging behavior, turning over logs and digging for insects and roots. Thaddeus recognized this as an opportunity to capture images showing the educational aspect of maternal bear behavior, as the mother demonstrated food-finding techniques to her offspring. The cubs mimicked their mother's actions, learning skills needed for independent survival. Thaddeus repositioned himself for a better angle, showing all 3 bears in the same frame. His envisioned composition perfectly illustrates the family dynamic he had been documenting. As he moved along the ridge, carrying his heavy telephoto lens and tripod, The loose shale beneath his feet gave way without warning. Thaddeus lost his footing and began sliding down the steep slope, his heavy camera equipment clattering against rocks as he desperately tried to arrest his fall. The sound echoed across the meadow like an avalanche, immediately alerting every nearby animal to the disturbance. Expensive lenses and camera bodies were scattered across the rocky slope as he tumbled helplessly downward. The grizzly sow's massive head snapped up from her foraging, her ears pricked forward as she located the source of the commotion. Thaddeus continued sliding down the slope, creating a cascade of rocks and debris that seemed to amplify in the wilderness silence. He managed to stop his descent about 40 yards down from his original position, but the damage to his concealment was complete. Ezra watched in horror from behind his tripod as the situation rapidly deteriorated. The sow had identified Thaddeus as a potential threat to her cubs. She responded with the lightning-fast aggression that made grizzly bears one of North America's most dangerous predators. Her protective instincts overrode any previous tolerance for human presence. The sow charged up the slope incredibly quickly, covering the 80-yard distance in seconds. Her massive paws found purchase on terrain that had defeated Thaddeus's careful footing, demonstrating the superior athleticism that made grizzlies such formidable predators. Ezra could see the determination in her posture as she closed the distance with mechanical precision. Thaddeus had time for only one terrified scream before the bear reached him. His expensive camera equipment was scattered across the rocks as the grizzly sow knocked him down and began mauling him with mechanical efficiency. The attack was swift and brutal, driven by pure maternal instinct rather than predatory behavior. The sow's primary concern was eliminating what she perceived as a direct threat to her cub's safety. Ezra remained frozen behind his video equipment, simultaneously horrified by his colleague's fate and terrified that any movement might draw the bear's attention to his position. He watched helplessly as the attack concluded, the sow standing over Thaddeus's motionless body for several minutes before calmly returning to her cubs in the meadow below. Wildlife rangers who later investigated the incident ruled that the sow had acted defensively, protecting her cubs from what she perceived as a direct threat. The investigation revealed that Thaddeus's fall had brought him well within the critical distance that grizzly mothers considered dangerous to their offspring. The bear's response, while tragic, was entirely predictable given the circumstances and the powerful maternal instincts that drive sow behavior. Ezra eventually managed to signal for rescue using their satellite communicator, though he remained on the ridge for several hours before help arrived. The psychological trauma of witnessing his mentor's death would end his career in wildlife photography, as he found himself unable to work near dangerous animals. The incident was a stark reminder of the thin line between successful wildlife documentation and fatal miscalculation in the wilderness. The Gallatin Range in southwestern Montana has long been considered some of the finest hunting territory in the American West. It combines diverse wildlife, challenging terrain, and a pristine wilderness setting. In October 2016, the region was experiencing an exceptional elk season, drawing hunters from across the country to test their skills against one of North America's most prized game animals. The area's healthy grizzly bear population added an element of danger many hunters found appealing, though few truly understood the risks involved. The Gallatin Range, part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, was shaped by glacial activity and volcanic forces over millions of years. The landscape of steep valleys, dense timber, and alpine meadows provided a perfect habitat for elk and their predators. Local hunting guides warned visiting hunters about the region's grizzly population, but many experienced outdoors people felt confident in their ability to avoid dangerous encounters through proper preparation and awareness. Marcus Hawthorne, a bow hunter, had been pursuing elk in the Gallatin Range for over a decade, building an intimate knowledge of the animal migration patterns and preferred feeding areas. Marcus was considered an expert archer and wilderness survivalist at 42, having successfully harvested elk in some of Montana's most challenging terrain. His preference for hunting alone stemmed from his belief that solo hunting provided better opportunities for close encounters with wary game animals. On October 23rd, Marcus began his pursuit before dawn, moving through dense timber in search of a large bull elk he had been tracking for 3 days. The early morning fog provided excellent cover for his approach, but limited visibility to just a few yards. Marcus relied on his experience and knowledge of elk behavior to guide him through the challenging conditions. The fog created an almost supernatural atmosphere in the forest, muffling sounds and ghostly shapes among the trees. Marcus moved with practiced stealth, frequently stopping to listen for elk vocalizations or antlers scraping against branches. His compound bow was ready for an immediate shot, with a broad head-tipped arrow nocked and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The terrain in this section of the Gallatin Range was particularly challenging, with large rock outcroppings and fallen timber creating natural obstacles that required careful navigation. Marcus had learned to use these features to his advantage, approaching feeding areas from downwind positions that concealed his presence from the keen senses of elk and other wildlife. As Marcus rounded a large rock outcropping, he suddenly found himself face to face with a massive grizzly bear bedded down in the sheltered area behind the rocks. The bear was enormous, easily weighing over 500 pounds, and appeared to be an older male in prime condition. The animal had been resting in the protected spot, possibly digesting a recent meal or seeking shelter from the morning cold. The encounter happened so quickly that neither Marcus nor the bear had time to process the situation rationally. Marcus later estimated that he was less than 10 feet from the grizzly when they made eye contact, well within the critical distance that triggers defensive responses in surprised bears. The animal exploded upward from its resting position with shocking speed and power that defied its massive size. Marcus instinctively reached for his bear spray, which was clipped to his pack according to standard safety protocols recommended by the State Wildlife Agency. However, the bear's charge was too fast for him to deploy defensive measures. The grizzly covered the short distance between them in less than 2 seconds, striking Marcus with tremendous force before he could draw his spray or raise his bow in self-defense. The impact knocked Marcus off his feet, sending his expensive compound bow flying into the surrounding brush. The bear's massive paws struck him broadside, lifting his 180-pound frame as easily as a child might toss a stuffed animal. Marcus found himself airborne for an eternity before crashing into a large boulder with bone-crushing force. The collision with the rock broke 3 of Marcus's ribs and opened deep gashes across his shoulder and chest where the bear's claws had made contact. He lay motionless against the boulder, expecting the grizzly to follow up with a killing attack that would end his life in the Montana wilderness. Instead, the bear stood over him, huffing and swaying as it assessed whether he posed a continued threat to its safety. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 seconds, the grizzly turned and walked back into the timber, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Marcus remained conscious throughout the encounter, though he was too injured and shocked to move for several minutes after the bear departed. He later realized that his survival was due entirely to the bear's assessment that he was no longer a threat. Marcus crawled approximately 50 yards to a well-used game trail despite his injuries, hoping other hunters might find him there. His satellite communicator had been damaged in the attack, leaving him dependent on chance encounters for rescue. The device's plastic casing cracked when he struck the boulder, rendering it useless for emergency communication. Marcus spent 5 agonizing hours on the trail, drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and shock. His broken ribs made breathing difficult, and the deep claw wounds continued bleeding despite his attempts at field dressing. He began to accept that he might die alone in the wilderness when 2 other bow hunters discovered him and immediately called for emergency evacuation. Wildlife officials who investigated the incident concluded that the bear had reacted defensively to a surprise encounter rather than exhibiting predatory behavior. The grizzly's decision to disengage after neutralizing the perceived threat was typical behavior for bears that don't view humans as prey. Marcus's recovery took several months, and the experience convinced him to hunt only in groups for the remainder of his hunting career, understanding that the wilderness demanded respect and preparation that even decades of experience couldn't guarantee. Larsen Bay on Kodiak Island, Alaska, had served as a vital commercial fishing hub since the early 1900s, when Russian and American settlers first recognized the area's incredible salmon runs. The remote location, accessible only by boat or small aircraft, attracted commercial fishermen willing to work in dangerous conditions for the promise of exceptional catches. In July 2015, the bay was experiencing one of the most productive salmon seasons in recent memory, drawing fishermen from across Alaska to establish temporary processing stations along its rugged shoreline. Kodiak Island, known as the Emerald Isle of Alaska, stretches over 3,500 square miles of pristine wilderness, dominated by towering mountains, dense forests, and countless salmon streams. The island's isolation from mainland Alaska created a unique ecosystem where massive brown bears evolved into the largest subspecies in the world. These Kodiak bears, some weighing over 1,000 pounds, learned to associate salmon runs with easy food sources, making encounters with human fishing operations increasingly common. Two experienced commercial fishermen, Ben Thompson and David Carlson, had arrived at Larsen Bay in mid-July to take advantage of the peak salmon run. Both men had worked in Alaska's fishing industry for over a decade, understanding the risks and rewards of processing catches in remote locations. They established their temporary station on a gravel beach approximately 2 miles from the nearest permanent settlement, believing the isolation would provide access to the best fishing spots without competition from other operations. Thompson and Carlson had invested in high-quality processing equipment, including sharp filleting knives, industrial-grade scales, and portable refrigeration units powered by marine batteries. Their operation was designed to quickly process large quantities of salmon, maximizing their profit during the brief but lucrative fishing season. The setup required them to work in the open air, making concealment from wildlife nearly impossible. Kodiak Island's massive brown bears were known to frequent salmon streams during the summer runs. Still, Thompson and Carlson had worked in bear country before and felt confident avoiding dangerous encounters through proper food storage and awareness of their surroundings. Following the Department of Fish and Wildlife recommendations, they installed electric fencing around their processing area and carried bear spray as additional protection. On July 28th, Thompson was processing a particularly large salmon, weighing approximately 20 pounds, when he noticed movement in the tree line about 50 yards away. A massive Kodiak bear, standing nearly 9 feet tall and weighing an estimated 800 pounds, had emerged from the dense alder thicket surrounding their beach location. The animal moved with the confident gait of an apex predator that had never learned to fear humans. Thompson had been taught that standing his ground was the proper response to a bear encounter, particularly when the animal might be testing human resolve rather than showing genuine aggression. He remained motionless beside his processing table, still holding the partially gutted salmon, hoping the bear would lose interest and return to the forest. Conventional wisdom suggests that running or showing fear triggers a chase response in predators. The bear approached steadily, showing no signs of hesitation or uncertainty. Its massive head swayed back and forth as it tested the air, clearly drawn by the strong scent of fresh salmon blood and fish oils that covered Thompson's work area. The animal's small eyes focused on Thompson with an intensity that suggested predatory rather than merely curious behavior. Carlson watched the encounter unfold 20 feet away, initially believing that his partner's calm response would successfully deter the approaching bear. Alaska fishermen frequently encountered bears during salmon season, and most encounters concluded without violence when humans followed established protocols. However, this particular bear seemed unusually bold and determined in its approach. The bear's massive paws left deep impressions in the gravel as it closed the distance to the processing station. Its thick brown fur rippled with each powerful stride, and its shoulder muscles bunched with obvious strength. The animal's approach was methodical and purposeful, suggesting it had successfully taken food from humans before and expected no serious resistance. The bear suddenly lunged forward, covering the remaining distance in 3 powerful bounds. Instead of taking only the salmon and retreating, as bears typically do when scavenging human food sources, the animal knocked Thompson to the ground and seized both the fish and the man who held it. The attack happened quickly and violently, leaving Carlson no time to intervene effectively. Carlson screamed and fired an emergency flare from his safety kit, hoping the bright light and loud noise would drive the bear away from his partner. The flare exploded in a brilliant red burst above the beach, creating enough distraction for him to see that the bear had dragged Thompson toward the tree line while still clutching the salmon in its other massive paw. The bear disappeared into the thick vegetation with its prey, leaving behind a scene of scattered equipment and blood-stained gravel. Carlson attempted to follow the drag marks into the forest, but quickly realized that pursuing an 800-pound predator into dense cover would likely result in his death. He activated his satellite emergency beacon and waited for rescue while maintaining visual contact with the forest edge. Troopers from Fish and Wildlife officers arrived the following morning via helicopter, accompanied by experienced bear trackers and armed rangers. They located Thompson's body approximately 200 yards into the forest, partially buried under a mound of dirt and debris in typical brown bear caching behavior. The salmon had been completely consumed, but the bear had treated the human as additional food rather than simply a competitor for the fish. According to the Fish and Wildlife protocols, the bear was tracked for 2 days before being located and euthanized. Examination of the animal revealed it to be an older male in poor physical condition, possibly explaining its unusually aggressive behavior toward humans. Carlson required psychological counseling for months after witnessing his partner's death and eventually left commercial fishing permanently, unable to return to the remote locations where such encounters remained possible. The Baffin Bay region between Greenland and Canada's Arctic archipelago had become increasingly important for climate research as scientists worked to understand the rapid changes occurring in polar ice formations. In November 2018, a research vessel was trapped in forming sea ice approximately 150 nautical miles from Pond Inlet, Nunavut. The ship carried 14 scientists and technicians on a mission to study ice formation patterns and their impact on Arctic marine ecosystems, representing one of the most comprehensive research efforts in the region's history. Baffin Bay had been named after English explorer William Baffin in 1616, though Inuit peoples had navigated these treacherous waters for thousands of years before European contact. The bay's unique geography created ideal conditions for studying climate change effects, as warm Atlantic waters met Arctic currents in a dynamic system that scientists were only beginning to understand. The research vessel represented cutting-edge polar exploration technology, designed specifically for extended operations in some of Earth's most hostile environments. The research vessel was a reinforced ship designed for polar operations. It featured a steel hull capable of withstanding moderate ice pressure and elevated decks that protected it from wildlife encounters. The captain had 20 years of Arctic navigation experience and felt confident that the ship's design and her crew's training would ensure their safety during extended ice entrapment. The vessel's specifications included heated compartments, emergency supplies for extended isolation, and communication equipment capable of reaching rescue services across vast Arctic distances. The research team, led by a distinguished scientist, had been conducting ice core sampling and water temperature measurements when the weather conditions changed dramatically. A sudden Arctic storm system brought temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius and created wind conditions that accelerated ice formation around their position. Within 18 hours, the research vessel was surrounded by solid ice formations that made movement impossible. Rather than attempting a dangerous extraction through unstable ice, the captain decided to shut down the engines and settle in for what could be several weeks of waiting for natural ice movement or icebreaker assistance. The crew established heating protocols and prepared for an extended stay in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Emergency procedures included rationing food supplies, maintaining communication schedules, and monitoring equipment to prevent critical system failures. During their third night of entrapment, strong Arctic winds began building snowdrifts against the ship's port side. The blowing snow and existing ice formations created a gradually rising slope that connected the ship's deck level to the surrounding ice surface. The crew noticed this development, but did not immediately recognize its potential significance for local wildlife movement, focusing instead on maintaining their vessel's operational systems. At 2:47 a.m. on November 15th, the motion sensor system at the ship's cargo ramp experienced a technical malfunction and failed to trigger its alarm. The sensor was designed to detect any movement on the external deck areas, providing early warning of potential intruders or equipment problems. Without this early warning system, the crew remained unaware that their ship was no longer isolated from the surrounding ice environment. A massive polar bear, weighing approximately 600 pounds and measuring over 8 feet in length, used the wind-built snow slope to climb aboard the research vessel. The animal moved with surprising stealth across the deck, its massive paws making virtually no sound on the ice-covered metal surfaces. Polar bears are excellent climbers and swimmers, making the ship's 10-foot elevation irrelevant once the snow bridge provided access to the deck level. The bear entered the ship through the cargo hold, which had been left partially open to allow for equipment ventilation and prevent dangerous gas buildup from their scientific instruments. Inside the hold, the animal encountered a maze of scientific equipment, supply crates, and emergency materials worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The bear began systematically investigating each item, using its powerful claws and jaws to tear open containers and scatter contents across the floor. The destruction was both methodical and devastating. The bear crushed expensive scientific instruments designed for precise Arctic measurements, punctured a fuel drum that began leaking diesel across the hold floor, and dragged an emergency life raft completely across the storage area. The noise of the destruction was muffled by the ship's insulation and the howling Arctic wind outside, preventing the sleeping crew from immediately recognizing the threat aboard their vessel. Sam Levesque, a young research technician from Quebec, had been sleeping in his cabin when a coolant alarm sounded from the ship's environmental systems. Following standard protocols, Levesque went to the lower deck to check on the cooling system that kept their scientific samples at proper temperatures. He descended into the cargo hold area, unaware that a massive predator was sharing the space. The polar bear detected Levesque's presence immediately, turning from its investigation of supply crates to focus on this new development. The animal moved toward the technician with obvious predatory intent, its small black eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting in the hold. Levesque found himself trapped between towering stacks of equipment crates with the bear blocking his primary escape route. In a moment of desperate inspiration, Levesque threw himself toward a nearby maintenance access door and managed to slam it shut just seconds before the bear's massive bulk struck the barrier. The steel door held against the impact, though Levesque could hear the animal's claws scraping against the metal as it attempted to reach him through the sealed opening. The sound of claws on steel would haunt his nightmares for months afterward. The polar bear remained aboard the research vessel for 47 minutes, continuing its systematic destruction of the cargo hold before eventually departing the way it had entered. The crew discovered the extensive damage the following morning, with massive paw prints leading across the deck and down the snow slope to the ice below. The financial cost of the destroyed equipment exceeded $200,000, but the psychological impact proved far more significant. Although no crew members lost their lives during the harrowing incident, the psychological toll it exacted on the research team was deep and lasting. The encounter shattered the illusion of security that had been built on steel walls and elevated decks. Several scientists, visibly shaken and unable to sleep for days, formally requested early evacuation at the first available weather window. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, claws, and the raw power to breach their sanctuary. For many, the knowledge that Arctic predators could so easily board their vessel transformed the ship from a place of exploration into a vulnerable prison, adrift in hostile territory. In the aftermath, research protocols were significantly overhauled. New standards mandated installing advanced motion detection systems, reinforcing wildlife barriers, and stricter night watch protocols. But even with these precautions, the crew's collective confidence in the vessel's protective capability had been irreparably shaken. The experience served as a chilling reminder. Nature is the ultimate authority in the untamed Arctic wilderness, and human constructs, no matter how engineered, are temporary defenses against its overwhelming force.